Hey there, I'm Kevin Fontenot, and I'm here with Scott Magdalein. We're your host of the Thriving Ministry Teams podcast, the podcast where we're talking about all things related to church leadership, training, and discipleship. And today, we're going to be talking about something that's really fun for Scott and I. We're going to be talking about all the times that we failed. So we're going to get really transparent, talk about all the frustrations, all the times of failure, maybe leave out a couple things just so you can imagine a few things, but we're going to get down and dirty with it. And I'm going to hand it off to Scott, and he's just going to start us out here.
I was about to say, like all the things of failure, I don't think that there's enough time. I don't think anybody will listen to all of our failures.
5-hour podcast today.
Certainly not mine. Yeah, so I do believe in transparency. I'm not going to be that transparent though. So I've been very picky about the ones I want to talk about today. Honestly, because there's some higher level trends or lessons that I learned beyond just like the lesson that I learned. Like, and like a lot of my failures, I learned like a really specific lesson, how I handled a situation poorly or how I could have made a decision differently. But I don't want to go there because a lot of those aren't like transcendent themes. I'm going to talk about 2 failures that I experienced that God walked me through, or I endured, or however you want to talk about that. That I learned something that has really helped me in the future as well. So like these are like high level themes, I guess you could say, from these 2 failures. And I'm going to talk about, my life is sort of like split between ministry and business. And so I've got a lot of ministry experience and therefore a lot of ministry failures and a lot of business experience and business failures. And so, and when I say business, I mean like running my own business and, trying to do something as an entrepreneur. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a business thing. The second thing I'm going to talk about is a ministry thing. As always, these failures are like in the past for me, far enough in the past where I feel like I can talk about them. But I promise you, like going through the failure, it hurt. And like, I was not happy about it. And honestly, even at the time, I wasn't like, man, I'm learning a great lesson through this. I was much more likely I was cursing under my breath, ticked off about what I was going through, or, just a mistake that I'd made, or maybe shifting blame at the other time and blaming someone else for, what my failure was. So anyway, so I'm going to do one failure and then I'm going to pass it off to Kevin. He's going to do the next failure. It'll give me a little break. Is that cool, Kevin?
That works.
Okay.
I guess we can go back and forth. So that way we don't have to harp on you too much. I was just hoping that we were going to stay on you for a while. And then at that point, people would stop listening, right?
No, you're not that lucky. So my first failure in 2012, I had spent probably 4 years before that as mostly a product manager or project manager kind of person, organizing tech projects, organizing tech developers and designers and teams. I'd worked on my own products. I'd worked as a consultant at a couple of companies, and I'd worked at Life Church doing some YouVersion stuff and some Life Church Open and Church Online, that kind of stuff. And so I'd been in the product world, still in the tech business, but in the product world. And I wanted to build my own thing. So that meant I had to learn, and I knew some basic kind of front-end web design stuff, but I really needed to go back and learn like a programming language so I could build something on my own. Then I had this idea for something that I felt like was a good idea. So I went to Treehouse, and teamtreehouse.com. If you're curious, if you want to know about how to build something or you want to learn some tech stuff, teamtreehouse.com. I do highly recommend that. That's not the failure. Went to teamtreehouse.com, learned how to build stuff, learned, of course, HTML and CSS, learned JavaScript better, learned Ruby on Rails, picked up a big old Rails for Dummies type of book. It wasn't an exact book, but it was a big book that I literally read, a book with pages in it, learning code and like copying code from the book and into my IDE. And anyway, so I learned Rails to build this specific thing called Pic Digest. It's spelled PIC digest.com. So in 2012, things were like the social media world was a little bit different. It was still pretty spread out, but also there was like open APIs and you could still kind of work with stuff. Like Cambridge Analytica hadn't messed everything up on the Facebook side of things. Facebook had just purchased Instagram for $1 billion. And so Instagram was like on its like trajectory up and was like, have a bunch of money to grow. And Twitter was, still pretty open, and Twitter was still fun at the time. And so, and also Flickr still existed, by the way. Like I guess Flickr maybe still exists now, but who talks about it or uses it? Maybe just like photographers, maybe. I don't even know.
Maybe. Nobody.
So the idea behind Pic Digest was, like as a parent, I would post like a picture of a kid to Instagram, and then maybe a different picture of a different kid to Facebook, and then so I had all these photos everywhere, right?
Still your kids though, right? Not just
Still
a random kid.
Yeah, a different kid. Yeah, my children to did these different social media platforms and content platforms. But my family and closer friends would usually only follow me on one area, right? So like I had like grandparents, of course, that were on Facebook and seeing pictures I posted to Facebook, but they weren't on Instagram at the time. And so, but like I had friends on Instagram, but they weren't my friends on Facebook because they weren't doing Facebook anymore because it wasn't cool. And of course, all my tech friends on Twitter, which didn't really care about my kids, but they follow me on Twitter and not the other places. So I had like these kind of tribes of followers, and I wanted a place where I could bring all of the photos, because we're post a lot of photos, bring all of the photos in together for the people who wanted to not miss a moment. The idea was, like grandparents and friends are missing pieces about me posting photos. So Pic Digest is exactly what it sounds. It takes a digest of all the photos I post each day to these different for my different profiles, collects them into an email, and sends them out to my family, my friends, as an email, a nice, beautiful single column email with everything formatted nicely or whatever, right in the email. And it was beautiful. It worked well, worked awesome. The first 20 or 30 people that saw it liked it, and I built it myself. I had a lot of help from a guy named John McCarty. He helped me at the time a bunch, but I built it for the most part myself. And I was really proud of it. And then like past the launch phase, that first month probably of launch, and things kind of trickled, and it became work. Like it went from like really fun, an idea, and everybody's on board, to the topic changed or the subject changed. And it was hard to get people's attention about this new tool.
Yeah.
And it became work getting their attention. And so I just kind of quit it. Like I just was like, it's not worth the effort anymore. I've got a handful, a couple dozen paying customers, but that's not even close to even covering our server costs, because the server costs at the time were pretty hefty. And so I just kind of let it go, and so I guess like my failure in that was leaning too heavily on launch, leaning too heavily on excitement, on my own interest momentum, like the momentum of my interest in the thing, and then being tricked or fooled or deceived into thinking that because there's not excitement, that it's not worth doing anymore. And for me, that was a big failure, because I quit. Like the main thing here is that I quit too soon. What's funny is like 4 or 6 months later, something like that, some other tool came out. I forget the name of it, but it got like venture funding, like $5 million right out of the gate. And like this big, I don't know where they are. They probably shut down by now, but at the time it was like, oh my gosh, I quit way too soon. And it was the same exact thing. It was essentially Pic Digest rebranded. Anyway, so I learned a huge lesson from that failure, to number one, not trust my own like motivational curves, which Kevin knows are pretty high and pretty low. But also to not like just quit too soon, I guess.
Yeah, we have a custom emoji in Slack that's Chicken Little, just so you can put it whenever Scott's in one of those up and down moments. So he's being dead serious on the up and downs. And, you talked about having to read a book on Ruby on Rails, and that kind of ties into the first failure I want to talk about. So I'm a college dropout, and that's something that has bugged me for a while. It's something that I don't really talk about. It's something that I always think about quite often, just personally with my wife. And it's something that I've had to reflect on a lot over time. And today I'm ready to talk about it. So this should be fun. So speaking of like having...
This is like counseling, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's like counseling. I'm pouring my heart out, and I'm going to have some freedom afterwards. And it's going to be great. But in college, I switched around majors probably 10 different times. So at first I went to a state school that where I'm living now in Denton, Texas, called University of North Texas. Spent a year and a half there, and probably switched my major probably 5 to 10 times during that year and a half. So I had already completed a year of college before going to college while I was in high school. So didn't have a whole lot of time where I really would have had to complete college. But I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. And I knew that I was always wanting to do ministry. I was called to ministry. And so that was what my focus was. But I was in a state school, and because it was cheaper and just wanted to get a degree out of the way, but I could never figure out what I wanted to do. And so I jumped around from everything from history to communications to sociology at one point to computer science. And in our computer science final, we actually had to write code by hand, like with a pencil and paper. To write out code, which seemed like the most ridiculous thing ever, and probably has a reason that I don't have a computer science degree today, is I had to write out code by hand. But
I can't imagine trying to like parse out between like a parentheses and a bracket, or like a colon.
And it was in C. And it was in C. So it wasn't like this nice language. We're talking about C here. So I don't even know why we had to start with that, but that's a completely different subject that's way too nerdy for this podcast to talk about.
Yeah.
But after a year and a half, I decided that I was going to go to Bible college. So I switched schools completely, went to Southwestern Assemblies of God University in Waxahachie, did an online degree so I could stay where I was at, because I was really involved in some ministries at that point and didn't want to leave the city that I was at because really felt called there, and probably spent another year kind of trying to catch back up. So I'd spent a year and a half just kind of wasting time at University of North Texas. Didn't really get anywhere because I kept changing degrees. And so I had my basics done, but that was it. So went to SAGU and tried to start doing this ministry degree. And it was all stuff that I already knew. So it was hard for me to get motivated for it. I've always been a reader. I believe that if you want to lead, you need to be reading different things. And so I've always been a person that really enjoys learning, but like to do it at my own pace and like to figure out things. And so it's really hard for me to go in and dedicate myself to a particular learning track. And that's something that I've struggled with for a long time. I've always been really smart. Really, school's always been easy for me. It's just been hard for me to put in the time and effort. And so one of my biggest failures is just not being able to commit to anything. And so I ended up dropping out of SAGU. It's something that probably still affects me today. It's something that I have to think through a lot of quitting and failure and giving up on things too early. It's definitely gotten better with my wife, because she's like, are you sure you really want to quit that? Is now the time? And she's been a lot more motivational to me than I am to myself, and kind of helps me recognize those times where I'm just being irrational with my desire to quit something too soon. So it's kind of similar with what we're talking about, but mine's just a lack of commitment to things. I just can't see the end goal. And if I get frustrated with it or can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, I just give up. And that's really started with college, something that still bugs me today. But that's failure number one for Kevin, dropping out of college.
Yeah, man. Whew. Okay, so therapy's going good today. Therapy's going good. I will say this. Kevin has committed to Trained Up for a year and a half now or so. And he's been with us for a year and a half. And the amount of growth that I've seen just in you, Kevin, over a year and a half, I do believe that you committing to something will make you like exponentially. Oh, I love you doing. Yeah. Anyway,
doing heart symbols for you guys listening to the podcast and not video.
All right. So my second thing I'm going to talk about, this is ministry related. It's a little bit more recent. It was a few years ago, or maybe a couple of years ago. And okay, so here's what it was. I was a college minister at a church here in Jacksonville, and church is great. Staff is great. The pastor is great. Great vision. Really just one of those really solid, kind of regional churches, about 2,000, 2,500 people that attend there at 2-3 campuses. And they just really solid, good at doing ministry. You know, there's no superstar at the church. Nobody like goes for any particular single person or anything like that. Just people love to attend the church. And college ministry was one of the ministries that the church was really trying to do better at, to keep students that were in high school and that were going to one of the local schools. We have three great local schools here for college. And the church was having a tough time keeping those students engaged through college ministry. So they brought me on to help out with that, and sort of also kind of rehab it after a few different leaders had gone through. And when I came in first 6 months, I just kind of held down towed the line or whatever, just kind of continued on what was happening and built trust and, that sort of thing. And then it came time to start to lead some change after I built some trust. And I didn't. So one of the things is I didn't lead this change too quickly. It wasn't drastic change that I led. I did have trust They did trust me. So it wasn't like this thing where I came in like first week and I was like, okay, we're going to break everything and try to rebuild it. So that wasn't my failure in this. So my failure in this college ministry was that I undercommunicated what we were changing, why we were changing it, where we were going. And what's funny is like all of the changes, everything that we were doing was totally legit. It was good ideas. It was a move toward biblical nature of a ministry within a church. It was a move toward bolstering the health and stability of the ministry. It was a move toward equipping leaders to take on more responsibility in the ministry. It was a move toward more Bible study and less kind of events driven kind of stuff. The church staff, my leadership at the church was behind it and like all for it. And the failure wasn't in the structure of the change. It wasn't in, did I do it too quickly? It was 100% just that I didn't communicate it well enough. So which is, for me, I guess, I can see that kind of trend in other areas, in other projects that I've been a part of or other teams I've been a part of, where I tend to assume that people know more or understand more or kind of get it or grok it, as we would say in programming world. Like they understand it in like their core of who they are. They understand why we're going the direction we're going. I underestimated that the level of communication that I would need to lead change in this relatively small ministry with 8 volunteer leaders and a handful, a few dozen people, college students in the ministry. And so like the result of that was a full out rebellion. Like when we started implementing the changes, it was like mutiny on the high seas. There was like
picket lines and signs being around.
If it would have been socially acceptable for them to show up to church with picket signs, they would have showed up. Pitchforks and torches, maybe. But they just did. It was like a foreign object trying to be assimilated into a new body, and it just was completely rejected. And over the course of a few months, even with more communication after the fact that the changes were made, it was kind of it was too late. And so that was one of the things I regret in ministry is under communicating before the change and all the whys and what are we doing and where are we going and why are we doing it? What's the vision behind it and all that kind of stuff. So that's more of a tactical failure, but that led to kind of a ministry failure for me.
I think that's one that everyone can relate to. I mean, as you were talking, it wasn't one that I was going to share, but just thinking through some ways that's happened with me as well in ministry. It's a really common, especially in the church world, where it seems where staff turnover is really high. I think the average time on staff for any staff member is about 2 years. And so that staff turnover is so difficult to take on for a new leader, for an old leader, where that's something that everyone struggles with. And I know I have in my ministry when I was a small groups pastor at a church beforehand, where it was really difficult because we were completely trying to change things just like you were talking about it, and it just didn't end up going well at all. But that's not the failure I want to talk about. The second failure that I really want to talk about is one that has a happy ending. So gonna shift gears, leave it a little happy in therapy with that. A few years ago, I spent some time doing full-time missionary evangelism. So I quit my job, was doing IT work at the time, spent 6 months completely self-funded, going out doing street evangelism every day. Don't worry, I wasn't yelling at people or holding up signs or anything like that. Just having one-on-one conversations with people on the street, asking them, about spiritual things, about their relationship with the Lord, and had a lot of fruit with it. So it was something that I really enjoyed at the time, and had started it while I was going to a church. So I had a lot of friends that were doing full-time ministry as evangelists at a different ministry in Kansas City, and had kind of based what I was doing in my city in the Denton area off what they were doing locally. And so we had done some conferences together. I had taught with them, and I decided that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to create something exactly like they were doing. At the time, I was serving just as a small group leader at the church that I was at. And when I was asked to lead that small group, when our connections pastor had asked me to lead it a certain way and asked me to do something, I decided to completely ignore that advice and decided to do it my way, because I was doing my evangelism thing completely outside of the church and didn't have any oversight on it, didn't have anyone I was submitting to, and just thought of it as my own thing and something I didn't want to mix up with our church. I have no clue why, looking back, I wanted to do that. I guess it was just kind of more pride or selfishness at that point. I wanted all the glory in my younger days. But it ended up, I was trying to raise support for what I was doing, had quit my job, had about 6 months worth of savings that I knew I was going to be able to support myself at the time. I was unmarried, so I was living super cheaply, like in this old janky apartment, like barely eating, all those sorts of things that are fun. But came time where I was like, okay, I really got to get serious about getting supporters. And my wife was one of my first supporters. So that before we got married, which was a nice thing. And she actually accidentally gave to me twice. She tried to support me once and gave to me twice at the same time on accident. And she felt so embarrassed about it that she couldn't ask about getting her money back, even though she didn't have enough money to give twice. So that was a fun story after the fact. But I went up to our pastor at our church and, just kind of talked to him. I was like, hey, this is, what's going on. I'd really appreciate, you guys as a church supporting me, as a missionary. And because I knew that it was something our church had done. We always talk about supporting other people. So we went and had that conversation, and it definitely did not end the way that I expected it to. So instead of getting supported by our church, I ended up leaving our church, and not on good terms with our pastor. I had been, stubborn at the time, really selfish, and had, kind of said some things in jest to him in some of our meetings before that I didn't even realize had affected him. Just kind of talking about things about how we were doing things at the church, where I thought I was kind of helping us move towards and giving my opinion, where it really instead felt like an attack. And I definitely recognize, some of those things that I had done now, to kind of make it that way. So I ended up leaving the church completely, went to a different church at that point. And it was something that was really difficult because it was something that I wasn't expecting to do. I was expecting to leave that day having some, a new supporter for my ministry that I was doing. And it ended up turning everything that I was doing kind of upside down. Within a few months after that, I was no longer doing, full-time ministry. My wife and I had, decided to get married at that point. And so we were entering in a new season of life. And so it's kind of a natural transition for me to shift out of that because I wasn't able to raise the money that I was going to. But ended up for the next 3 years or so, still having that relationship that was broken. And, my wife and I now serve at that church. We have a great relationship with our pastor again. And that took a lot of humbling on myself. So we had attended a worship service at the church while we were on staff at another church, just to kind of get some refreshing. And our friends were the worship pastors at the time at the church. So we had a lot of connections, a lot of friends that were there, and just decided to go and worship. And while I was there in worship, I really felt the Lord speak to me. It's like, hey, you need to go and mend this relationship. Like it's not okay for you to just stay where you're at, to keep being frustrated about it and to not talk about it and hope it gets better. And so my ministry failure before was really about being selfish, about being prideful, trying to do things on my own, and, have learned the impact of relationships and learn the impact of doing things together. So much so that when it came time to start Disciple Labs, instead of trying to do it myself, I went up to Scott and said, hey, Scott, here's the idea that I want to do. Do you guys that trained up want to do this with me? And thankfully, Scott said yes at that point. But that's been a hard lesson that I've had to learn in my life based on, failure in relationships, which is very difficult to mend and get over.
Mm-hmm. Man, that's good. That's good. I'm glad we decided to talk through some of this stuff because it's especially in ministry, we don't like to talk about like failures in ministry because then we're afraid that it's gonna get us, like maybe we're gonna lose our job or we're gonna get lumped in with like moral failures of whatever. Right. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this today is I'd read like a headline in some news article somewhere about some prominent pastor, falling from grace. And I was like, you know what? Pastors fail, and like pastors, ministry leaders fail. And sometimes they fail big and they lose their job or they lose, their ministry for a season. And sometimes they fail small and it just hurts some relationships or it sets them back in the progress of their ministry. But if we're not open, if we can't talk about those failures, then how are we going to help each other? How are we going to learn from one another's failures? And to me, And also, how are we going to help each other grow? How are we going to help each other find forgiveness for the sin side of our failures? And how are we going to help each other overcome just the shortcoming side of our failures? And scripturally, it's completely sound. Like James 5:16, confess your faults, confess your sins one to another, and pray for one another that you may be healed. Like if pastors aren't doing that for one another, then how are we going to expect our people to follow that and seek spiritual health through the concept of confession to one another? So this is what maybe this wasn't necessarily confession. I mean, we have tens of thousands of listeners that are paying attention to this. So this isn't like, us in some like private confessional booth, but I do feel like it's valuable to be transparent with one another as ministry leaders.
Definitely. That's something that I know the leaders in my life that I respect the most are the ones that are the most transparent, that talk about the failures they've had, the struggles they've gone through, because it allows me to look at them in a light that I wouldn't necessarily look at them as. It's a lot harder to look at a leader, to serve a leader, to be committed to a leader if they're not open and honest about what's going on in their life, either in the past or the present. And so as ministry leaders, it's something that we absolutely have to do, not just with each other, but after we've come out the other side, we need to talk about those things with the people that we're leading as well, in order to be effective in our ministries.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Okay. So this is episode 4 of the Thriving Ministry Teams podcast. We are Scott and Kevin from trained-up.church. Come chat with us if you want a little chat confession. We would love to chat with you. If you need help with training your ministry volunteers, your ministry leaders, come chat with us. We also mostly Kevin runs Disciple Labs. So if you are concerned or you're curious about the spiritual health of your people, and you actually want to know from a real data stats perspective how people are doing, check out Disciple Labs. It just launched this week, and there's only 2 more days left of the launch discount, which I'm not even going to give on this podcast because you need to go to Disciple Labs, disciplelabs.com to check it out, to get that discount. You can chat with Kevin there directly on disciplelabs.com. This is the Thriving Ministry Teams podcast, and we'll see you next week.